I thought at first I might try to say something about the topic, but the relevance of statistical information to study the structure and use of language, but I realized very quickly I wouldn't have anything to say about that, except to try to correct some very persistent misinterpretations of things that were written 50 years ago. But you can do that easily enough by yourselves if you're interested. It really just amounts to reading carefully half a dozen pages in several scattered articles and books. So I'll drop that topic and turn to what seems to me, still seems to me after all these years, the right way to do the study of language structure. That means syntax in the broad sense, everything that goes on in the head. Syntax, morphology, phonology, formal semantics, everything that doesn't require access to the world. The modern study of these topics back early 50s did take a pretty sharp break from prevailing notions, actually orthodoxies you might call them. One aspect of the break was to take seriously what was disparaged at the time as God's truth linguistics. That was supposed to be bad. This is kind of period of misunderstanding of logical positivism, which was rampant. So God's truth linguistics meant taking seriously the idea that there is some real entity that's part of the mostly the brain that constitutes the faculty of language and would be on a par with internal systems like, say, the immune system or the visual system or others. One of the subcomponents of a complex organism that interact to yield our capacities and use of them. So the modern, this approach in later years was called biolinguistics, and that's essentially the approach that began to take shape in the early 50s. Here in Cambridge, in fact, a couple of graduate students. If we take that seriously, if we do assume that there is a real object and we're trying to find out its characteristics and how it interacts with other components of the body, then we should be treating it exactly the way as any other. If we want to look at the growth and development of any system of the body, we expect that there'll be three primary factors that enter into that process. One will be some genetic endowment, which in the case of language will reflexively provide an infant with the not trivial capacity to select out of the environment evidence that's linguistically relevant. So essentially to map external data into linguistic experience. That's step one, provided by some part of the genetic endowment, which then furthermore sets the general framework within which some language can grow and develop and assume one of the possible forms that's permitted by this internal system. If current thinking is on the right track, there may be only a finite number of these. That's the first factor, genetic endowment. The theory of the genetic endowment is often called universal grammar in UG, but that's kind of borrowed from a traditional term, but adapted to a different framework, so it actually means something different. It doesn't refer to properties that are found in all languages, which was one traditional usage. Just the theory of the genetic endowment, whatever it is. And if language is a real object, we can be confident that that exists. It's often called a controversial hypothesis, but I mean, the alternative is magic. I mean, there's got to be something that accounts for the fact that my granddaughter picked out part of her environment as language related and almost reflexively developed the language, while her, say, pet kitten or chimp or songbird or whatever, exposed to exactly the same data, didn't even take the first step and couldn't even conceivably take the second. So either it's magic or there's a genetic endowment. If there's a genetic endowment, either there's a theory of it or there isn't. If there isn't, it means it's some mystery beyond our cognitive capacities. No particular point assuming that, so therefore there is a theory, so therefore there can't be a controversy about the existence of UG, contrary to reams of literature, which I'll avoid. So that's the first factor. The second factor is the external environment, which clearly has an effect. So one of my granddaughters came to know English, another one came to know Spanish, and obviously that had to do with the environment, which sets a choice within a pretty narrow framework. The third factor is just principles that are not specific to the language faculty, just recruited in the course of growth and development. And these could be of many kinds. So, for example, properties of the brain could determine the way language develops. Unfortunately, we don't know anything relevant about them, but someday we might. But that's one third factor property. Another one is principles of learning strategies, which doubtless exist and may very well be recruited in the acquisition of language. And it's at this point that one would expect, as one has always expected, that information about frequency, probability would turn out to be relevant. Has to be shown, of course, but that would be a natural expectation. And there is interesting work substantiating or giving some support for that natural assumption. Another third factor property, which one would expect to be particularly relevant for a computational system like language, it is a computational system fundamentally, would be just general principles of computational efficiency, which may very well be natural laws, not specific to language or to the organism, or maybe to organisms altogether, but just something in nature. That, I think, has increasingly come to be a plausible direction to search. Well, let me give a formulation of this expectation 40 years ago. We expect that acquisition will involve not just habit formation based on a few years of experience, as was then commonly believed, or millions of years of evolution yielding universal grammar, thesis that was then considered outlandish, but also principles of neural organization that may be even more deeply grounded in physical law, a proposal that was considered so outlandish that it couldn't even be heard. But I think we can now hear it. That formulation 40 years ago was misleading in particular in referring to millions of years of evolution. It's now reasonably clear that language emerged pretty suddenly and very recently in evolutionary time, probably in some window 50 to 100,000 years ago or something roughly like that. Doesn't matter if you move the numbers. Either way, it's a flick of an eye in evolutionary time, and something that happened apparently very fast. As soon as it happened, you see all kinds of effects in the archaeological record. It's what's sometimes called a great leap forward in cognitive capacity and what it reveals. And shortly after that came the trek from Africa. This is presumably some small breeding group where this happened, and then they started expanding all over the world, and very quickly were pretty much everywhere. So that's the period in which language seems to have evolved, emerged, and there's nothing surprising about emergence of this kind in evolutionary history. There's plenty of examples of it. In fact, there are some well-known paleoanthropologists like Ian Tattersall who claim much more generally that all of human intelligence emerged, in his word, at essentially this instant of time, instant from an evolutionary point of view. Well, if something like that's correct, then we would expect that that what emerged, and is then common to the whole species, is not the kind of biological entity that develops over a long period of time by what François Jacob called tinkering, sort of doing the best you can at any particular evolution, doing the best it can at with the tools that are around, which can lead to a lot of intricacy and complexity, path-dependent evolution and so on. But if it emerged suddenly, in an evolutionary sense, you wouldn't expect that. What you'd expect is that somehow what developed is very simple. In fact, maybe almost perfect. That is a perfect solution to design problems that were imposed by the circumstances and conditions prevailing at the time of emergence, which would, of course, be in a single individual. Mutations take place in a person, not a community. They can take over a community, but that would, something like that would be expected. And the proposal that this is true, which is, of course, a speculation, is sometimes called the strong minimalist hypothesis, SMT. The hypothesis states that what developed, suddenly what emerged, was in fact a perfect solution to design problems. Well, that's a thesis. It, say 20 years ago, would have sounded totally crazy. Now it doesn't sound that outlandish, and there's even reason to believe that something like it might turn out to be true. It's not an implausible speculation at this point, and there's been some success in moving in that direction. Well, to the extent that it suggests a kind of a methodological lesson, namely, if you want to study take a look at the range of phenomena that fall under what's loosely called language. There's endless problems everywhere you look, even problems in trying to figure out to which component of human capacity the phenomena belong, or what mixture of components. Are they even language, or are they something else? But one way of approaching them is to see if you can just disentangle them, take them apart, so that some parts of them do conform more or less to SMT, that is, would be perfect solutions to design problems, and then see how far that goes. It's a plausible approach to studying the complexity of language, and it's been reasonably successful in the last 15 years or so. Well, to the extent that this thesis holds, we can search for what we can call principled explanations to phenomena of language, or maybe not to phenomena that fall within what's loosely called language, namely explanations that reduce the phenomena to third factor properties. And here it appears increasingly that conditions of computational efficiency play quite a substantial role in this, maybe an overwhelming one. Now, that seems to be a very promising way to proceed. You couldn't really pursue it until pretty recently, when a lot of underbrush had been cleared away. But now it seems like a feasible research program, always kind of implicit in the study of biolinguistics, as indicated by the quote, somewhat misguided quote that I gave a moment ago, but now I think realistic. Well, let me say a couple of words about where I think we are now. Starting with this methodological principle, let's say, assuming language to be as perfect as possible, we would start with adopting the simplest possible operation that can yield that could yield the fundamental properties of language. The most basic elementary property of a natural language is that whatever's in the head, what's sometimes called the grammar, let's call it the internal language, generates an infinite array of structured expressions which are transferred to two interfaces with other parts of the body. An interface with a system of thought and interpretation and so on, call it the semantic interface, although the term could be misleading, but let's call it that. The semantic interface is one